A dog gave birth to an old woman's child. Sounds impossible, right? But what if I told you it actually happened? This is not just a story about animals. It's a story about memory, loss, and the mysterious ways love finds its way back. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. If you love emotional, meaningful stories that touch the heart, make sure to hit subscribe. We've got so many more waiting for you. In the wide open hills of southern Missouri, just outside a town that barely made it onto the map, lived a woman named Evelyn Carter. She was 76 years old and had lived alone for nearly 2 decades on her 40-acre farm. A quiet patch of earth with rolling pastures, an aging red barn, and a white farmhouse that creaked in the wind like it had stories of its own. Her days were slow, steady, and mostly silent. The kind of silence that grows thicker with time. Her only real company was Milo, a 10-year-old border collie with clouded eyes and a gentle soul. Evelyn and Milo shared a rhythm: morning coffee at 6 o'clock a.m., feeding the chickens by 6:30, and walking the perimeter of the pasture by 8. No one came to visit anymore. Her friends had either passed or moved to places where the winters weren't so cruel. That spring morning, the sun rose early and warmed the porch faster than usual. Evelyn sat on her rocking chair, a faded quilt over her lap, sipping black coffee from her chipped ceramic mug. A soft wind rustled the sycamore trees by the fence line. Everything felt the same, until she heard a low whimper from the barn. Milo had been pregnant for weeks, and Evelyn knew the day was close. She put down her coffee, grabbed her boots, and made her way across the gravel path toward the barn, about 200 feet from the house. The smell of hay and old wood met her at the door, and then she saw it. In the far corner, where an old pile of blankets had been laid out, Milo was curled into herself, panting heavily. Around her, 5 tiny puppies squirmed and squeaked, wet and wriggling, barely the size of her palm. But there was one that made Evelyn drop to her knees. It wasn't the smallest, it wasn't the loudest, but it was different. Its tiny body was covered in the same soft fur as its siblings, but its back legs were limp, barely moving, and on its back, right between its shoulder blades, was a faint heart-shaped birthmark, just like the one Evelyn had seen once before, long ago. But the eyes were what stopped her breath. One was a pale blue, the other was dark brown. She stared, frozen, as memories surged through her chest like a flood. A wave of emotion she hadn't felt in 60 years pulled her under, and tears began to fall down her wrinkled cheeks. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It can't be." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn walls. But inside, time had stopped. Because somehow, in the middle of her old, quiet life, something, or someone, had come back. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the wind blow through the fields, the creak of the old farmhouse settling into the night. But her mind wasn't in the present. It was back in 1968, back when she was just 18, back when she had fallen in love for the first time. His name was Joseph, half Cherokee, quiet, with warm eyes and a smile that made her forget the world. They had met at the town's only library. She was reading Steinbeck. He was sketching a bird on the back of a receipt. By the end of that week, they were inseparable. But in a town that small, and in a time that cruel, a love like theirs wasn't allowed. When Evelyn discovered she was pregnant, her world changed overnight. Her parents sent her away to a recovery home in Kansas, far from the whispers of town. They told her it was for the best, that girls like her didn't raise children, that babies born out of shame belonged to Gindato, not to mothers. Evelyn never got to hold him. She remembered the labor, the white sheets, the sound of nurses speaking in hushed tones. And then, nothing. Just a single glimpse. A baby boy, fragile and pink, with one blue eye and one brown. She remembered screaming as they took him away. And the last thing she saw was a small, heart-shaped mark on his back. No name, no burial, no goodbye. They told her he died, that his little body was too weak. But in her heart, Evelyn never truly believed it. That night, in her dreams, she saw him again, standing in the fields behind the barn, a boy of maybe 10, barefoot, his eyes mismatched, but filled with kindness. He looked at her and smiled. When Evelyn woke, tears soaked her pillow, and the sound of soft whimpers came again from the barn. Evelyn slipped on her robe and walked outside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She opened the barn door gently, afraid the creak might wake her from whatever this strange dream state was. Milo was sleeping peacefully, curled protectively around the puppies. But the smallest one, the one with the mark and the strange eyes, had separated from the litter. It lay there, staring up at her, quiet and still. She knelt beside him. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, just watched her. "You shouldn't be alive," she whispered. But neither should he. Her hand trembled as she reached out and picked him up. He was barely a pound, no heavier than a sack of flour. His fur was warm. His tiny heart beat steady under her fingers. Evelyn held him to her chest, rocking gently, as if she were rocking time itself. "I never got to name you," she whispered, "but I think I'll call you Theo." The next morning, Evelyn made a bed for Theo by the fireplace, a small box lined with towels, just the right size. She fed him with a tiny dropper, goat's milk mixed with a touch of honey. He couldn't nurse like the others, not with those back legs. But he fought. Oh, he fought. And every time she looked into his mismatched eyes, Evelyn felt something she hadn't known in years. Hope, but deep inside, a question stirred. Was this just coincidence, or had something long buried come back, in the only form it knew how? Whatever the truth was, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. This little soul had come back to her for a reason. Spring passed slowly. Theo, tiny, fragile, and never quite steady on his feet, continued to grow under Evelyn's careful, devoted hands. His hind legs remained weak, but he was determined. He dragged himself across the wooden floors, always finding his way back to Evelyn's feet, as if afraid that even a few inches apart would be too much. Evelyn, in turn, found herself laughing more, talking more, even if only to Theo. The loneliness never truly left, but somehow it felt lighter, like something in the air had changed. One early June evening, the rain came without warning. The wind howled through the sycamores, and the roof of the old chicken coop rattled with each gust. Evelyn had just poured herself a cup of chamomile tea when she heard it, a soft scratch at the door, followed by silence. When she opened it, Theo was gone. His tiny flannel blanket lay on the porch, soaked through and fluttering in the wind. "Theo," she called, heart sinking. "Where did you go, baby?" She grabbed her flashlight, pulled on her raincoat, and stepped out into the storm, guided not by logic, but by something deeper. A pull she couldn't explain. The fields were muddy and lightning danced far in the distance, but Evelyn didn't stop. Her steps were heavy, each one weighed down by memories too long buried. The air smelled like earth and grief. And then she saw it, a pair of mismatched eyes, one blue, one brown, shining in the flashlight's beam, just beyond the fence line. Theo was waiting. He sat motionless beneath an ancient oak tree in the far corner of the property. Evelyn stopped in her tracks. Her chest tightened. That tree. It was the very same tree where, over half a century ago, she had been forced to bury her newborn son, a decision she never made, but one her parents carried out in secret, in shame. She had been told to forget, told he was too weak to live, told it was better that way. But the soil remembered. Theo let out a soft whine and began pawing at the ground. His tiny body trembled, but not from the cold. He was digging, and in that moment, Evelyn collapsed to her knees in the mud. She placed her hands on the damp earth, her voice shaking through tears and thunder. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to leave you. I didn't choose this. They never let me hold you, but I never forgot." The rain poured harder, soaking her to the bone. But Evelyn didn't move. She stayed, hands on the earth, as if reaching for something she'd lost a lifetime ago. Then, something strange happened. Theo lifted his head toward the sky and let out a long, low sound. Not a bark, not a howl, but something closer to a child's cry. The wind quieted for just a moment, and Evelyn, trembling, whispered, "Is it really you?" She wrapped Theo in the edge of her coat and pressed him to her chest. And for the first time since 1968, she felt whole. After that night under the oak tree, something shifted, not just in Evelyn, but in the entire rhythm of the farm. The mornings, once gray and heavy, now began with a quiet sense of purpose. Evelyn rose earlier. She sang while brewing her coffee. She opened the windows again, letting the wind carry in the scent of wildflowers. She hadn't done that in years. Theo had become her shadow. He still struggled to walk, his back legs dragging behind him across the wooden floors. But he never let that stop him. Every room Evelyn entered, Theo followed, tail wagging slowly, eyes bright with something that almost felt human. Evelyn began building him a special sling out of old canvas and leather straps, something to support his legs while he moved. She adjusted it by hand every day, sewing in padding and soft lining from an old flannel shirt Joseph once gave her. "If you're back," she whispered one evening, "I want you to stay this time." And in her heart, she wasn't just talking to the dog. The neighbors began to notice the change. Evelyn, the quiet, reclusive widow no one had seen in months, was now walking through town every Sunday morning with a small dog in a sling across her chest. Some stared, some whispered, some chuckled kindly. "She treats that mutt like it's her child," they said. But there was no malice in their voices, just wonder, because even they could see. She looked younger somehow, softer, brighter. Day, while buying feed at the local store, Evelyn overheard a little girl tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, look at that doggy, he's smiling." Evelyn turned around and, sure enough, Theo was. One blue eye, one brown, both squinting up with pure contentment. The mother smiled, and for the first time in decades, a stranger started a conversation with Evelyn. "What's his name?" the woman asked. Evelyn looked down at Theo and smiled gently. "Theo," she said. "He found his way back to me, after all these years." The woman tilted her head, confused, but didn't ask. She just nodded and said, "Well, he's lucky to have you." Evelyn looked back at Theo, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe. "No," she whispered, "I'm the lucky one." That night, Evelyn placed Theo's small bed closer to hers. She lit a candle, something she hadn't done since Joseph passed, and as the flame flickered, casting warm shadows on the old wooden walls, She took out the only photograph she had left of her pregnancy, a black and white ultrasound, creased and faded. She set it beside Theo's bed. Then she lay down, staring at the ceiling, her heart beating slower and softer than it had in years. "We're okay now," she murmured to the quiet. "You're safe. I'm safe. We made it." Outside, the Missouri night wrapped around the house in a gentle hush. No wind, no thunder, just peace. For the first time in 60 years, the farmhouse felt like a home again. Summer faded gently into fall. The leaves around Evelyn's farm turned golden, then rusted orange. The air grew crisp, and the smell of hay and wood smoke filled the mornings. Inside the house, everything felt warm, not from the fireplace, but from something softer, something alive. Theo had grown stronger. His hind legs still didn't work, but that didn't stop him from dragging himself across the floor with unshakable determination. He'd bark when the mail arrived. He'd nuzzle Evelyn's ankles when it was time for tea. And every night, he'd curl at the foot of her bed and sigh. Not like a dog, but like someone who had finally come home. But life, even when beautiful, still moves forward. One September morning, Theo didn't wake up. He was lying in the patch of sunlight that always crept across the floor just before noon, curled up, peaceful. A soft smile in his mismatched eyes, as if, somehow, he'd waited for just the right moment to go. Evelyn knew the second she saw him. She didn't cry right away. She knelt beside him, her hand gently stroking his fur, and whispered, "Thank you for coming back to me." She wrapped him in the same flannel blanket she'd found him with on that stormy night, and carried him out to the old oak tree. There, beneath the roots that once held so much pain, she buried him with her own hands. But this time, she wasn't burying a secret. She was planting something new, something like forgiveness, something like peace. The seasons passed. People in town continued to talk about the woman with the mismatched-eyed dog. Some swore she looked 20 years younger now. Some said she must have made peace with her past. Some just said hello when they saw her, and that was enough. Evelyn still lived on her farm, still made tea at 6, still sat on the porch during sunset. But now, there was something different about her eyes, not filled with sorrow, but with memory, with meaning. One afternoon, a neighbor dropped off a stray puppy at her gate. Scrawny, hungry, unwanted. Evelyn smiled, knelt down, and opened the gate without hesitation. "Come in," she said. "There's room here for second chances." Some stories aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be felt. Maybe Theo was just a dog. Or maybe, just maybe, he was something more. A soul returned. A goodbye that had waited too long. A message from the past that said, love never truly disappears. It waits until we're ready to hold it again. So if you've lost something or someone, don't close your heart. Because even the smallest life, even a dog, can carry a piece of something greater than we'll ever understand. And sometimes, that's all the miracle we need.